All right, so last week we stopped in the middle of Romans chapter 5 in Romans, and before we move on to the rest of the Romans, I wanted to show this PowerPoint as an overview of what we're going to be going through the next few chapters, through chapter 8. And it's kind of funny, I made this, I'm going to give you a little background on what we're going to see today. Years and years ago, I would say at least 6 years ago, probably more. No, actually no. At least 8 years ago, I was actually in a discussion or a debate with somebody on Romans chapter 7. And we were discussing of whether the Torah has been abolished or not. And he was trying to say that the traditional interpretation of Romans 7 is talking about the Torah being abolished and things like that. And I was disagreeing, obviously, and we were going back and forth. And so I started coming up in my mind some visual aids to kind to communicate my point. And so I started jotting things down, and of course the conversation ended, and I went home, and I said, well, I don't want that to happen again. So I started fiddling with PowerPoint, and I started with chapter 7. As we'll see, went through chapter 7 here, and then I said, well, let me add a little bit of chapter 6 to get more of a context, and maybe add a little more chapter 8 to get the overall view, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so after hours and hours later, this is kind of what I came up with. I've been tinkering with this off and on for the last few years. And so I just find it extremely helpful when I sit down with somebody discussing this section. It's funny, I don't have to do a lot of talking now. I kind of go through it, I kind of explain it here and there. But the pictures and the visual diagrams that we're about to see does a lot of explaining for me. And I do my best to try to be as consistent as possible in explaining this from beginning to end. But that's kind of the background of where it started. The real meat of it starts at Romans chapter 7. But it's good to get the whole context to see the consistency throughout it. So, one of the things I like to do when I study the scriptures is try to be as consistent as possible with what the scriptures teach and how it affects other things I believe. So the way it starts out, it's going to start off kind of basic. The first couple of slides, just going to be kind of basic, just to kind of warm us up until when we get to Romans 7. The key thing is to understand the diagram or the different key code system. There's at least 5 different colors, and they represent something in the scriptures. And so the first one I came up with is blue. So every time we see the blue here, I should look over here. Every time we see blue, that represents us or a person. Okay, so this is going to be part of the diagram. All right, red represents the bonded to or the condition before faith. So basically, we have before and after faith. And then the opposite of that is purple, bonded or conditioned to after faith. And then we have green. Green is power or bond before faith. So again, we have the before and after faith. And orange is the power bond after faith. So orange and green are going to be opposites. All right, the underlined, when we say something underlined, this is the result of the outcome of the bond. And when we see a circle, the circle is usually going to be a circle around the blue. It means slavery or servant to what we are bonded to. All right, so that's kind of the overview of the outline. So basically, I'm going to get next page is going to be a sample of what we're going to see. Part of the diagram of this code system here. Okay? So the color code with the diagram. So here we have, we're going to see this over and over again. We're going to have the blue on the top, right? That represents us or you. And this little arrow here represents what we're bonded to. This is what we're bonded to before faith. That's why it's in red. Okay? So we're bounded to something before faith. And the green is the power of the bond that holds us together. And then, of course, the result of that bond, this is the result of this relationship here. And that's why it's underlined. All right? This is just a pattern we're going to see as we go through each verse. All right, and so then when we talk about being a circle around it, this is the slavery of the bond. So we're slave to this as a result of being under this bond. And of course, again, this will make more sense as we go through. All right, so this is the opposite of this. So here we are down here, and we're bonded to the after faith, and the bond after faith results in this bond here. It says, "For while we were still helpless, at the right time, Messiah died for the ungodly. And we talked about helpless there. See, it's in red because that was a time before our faith when we were in sin. And notice the ungodly is something that we are. We are ungodly, that's why it's in blue. Right? God demonstrated his own love towards us, and that while we were yet sinners, Messiah died for us. And then verse 10, for while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son. Much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. Now, I bring these up because this is a springboard we'll be learning here. And what I want to focus on is, I want to focus on the single word here, death or die. And here we see that death is the means of how God reconciles sinners to himself. You know, Yeshua had to die for us in order for us to be reconciled with God. But the question that I want to focus in on here, which is going to set the theme for the rest of the section, is this. How is death able to reconcile us to God? Why does death reconcile us to God? I mean, we know that the wages of sin is death, but why does death of his Son reconcile us to God? And so that's something we're going to come back to again at the end, kind of wrapping it up, of this idea of death bringing us to God. So Paul turns his focus on the problem of sin that is beyond the scope of the individual to a much larger one, the fall of man in Adam. And so here we have the idea, for by the transgression of the one, death reigned through the one, much more those who receive the abundance of grace and the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Yeshua Messiah. So then, as through the transgression there resulted condemnation to all men, even so through one act of righteousness there resulted justification of life to all men. So again, I just want to show the color coding here. The one is in red. That's the before faith, and the purple is going to be something after faith, as we'll see here in a minute. For as through one man's disobedience the many were rendered sinners, even so through the obedience of one the many were rendered righteous. Again, what he's talking about, and you know, like I said, I'm not going to go through too much detail of these verses because we're going to do that when we go back through verse by verse. But he's talking about Adam here, right? Adam is the one man, and Yeshua is the one man that he's making reference to. He's comparing the two. So a clear parallel of this verse is found in 1 Corinthians 15:22, and I think this just kind of cleans up what Paul is trying to say here. In 1 Corinthians 15:22 says, "For in Adam all die, so also in Messiah all will be made alive." So let's put this in a chart form. This is our first chart we're going to see. So everybody, when it says all in Adam, right? Are rendered sinners. Because it says, you see how it's in green here? Rendered sinners. So all in Adam were rendered sinners. That's our link to Adam. And what's the result of that? Death. That kind of make sense? Mm-hmm. All right, like I said, it's starting off kind of basic. We'll get to the meat of it a little later. But on the other side of it, everybody in Messiah, right, are what? Rendered righteous. And the result is life. Okay? So you can see how the diagram is kind of working here. So this basic outline we're going to see here, we're going to see this over and over again throughout the book of all the way to Romans chapter 8. So we're going to see this over and over again. And the reason why I do this is I want to get the consistency. So when we get to Romans chapter 7 and 8, we'll see how the consistent interpretation of that and the application of that will be. So let's talk about federal headship. Is everybody familiar with what federal headship is? Have you ever heard of that before? All right. Well, federal headship is a very biblical understanding of things. So, which your leader is a representative of the whole group. Okay. So this idea of federal headship, the two federal headships is obviously Adam and Yeshua. So on one side we have Adam, right? And basically, what I'm taking is everything that was in the previous verses. I'm going to put them in a different chart form to make it more clear. So in Adam, right, Adam committed this one transgression, and that was eating of the tree, right? When he wasn't supposed to. So through that one transgression, all men are rendered sinners through Adam. And as a result of all men being rendered sinners through Adam, they're considered condemnation. They're condemned before God. And the result of condemnation is what? Death. But on the flip side of it, we have another side. We have through Yeshua, and through his one act of righteousness, so that through that one act of righteousness, what happens to all men? They're rendered righteous. And as a result of being rendered righteous, they're justified. And as a result of being justified, their end result will be life. Is it possible then, is there a middle ground between Adam and Yeshua? No. You're either one or the other. There's no halfway point, right? You can't be neutral between the two. So, and that's very important, especially with the Romans chapter 8, because there's going to be some that believe that, well, you can kind of go make your way in the middle there and then go from there. And that is just simply an impossibility. And this is where we get the idea of federal headship. So what's in the head happens to everybody in that person. So if you're an Adam, you're going to be rendered death. And if you're Yeshua, you're going to be rendered life. Now, when I talk about neutral here, I'm talking about simply the result of being in that person. I'm not making reference to our physical bodies because, yes, even though we're saved in Yeshua and are considered righteous in God's eyes, we still have that sinful nature that we received from Adam. So I'm not talking about that mixture there. I'm talking about, yes, we're already considered righteous and we will receive life because of Yeshua, even though we're not fully redeemed yet. That's not what I'm making reference to here when I talk about being neutral. What I'm talking about is that you can't, you're either one or the other. So if you're a believer, you're in Messiah. You're not in Adam. You're not condemned. You're not going to receive death. So there's a direct correlation between Adam and Yeshua, right? If you're Adam versus Yeshua, all men being rendered sinners versus all men being rendered righteous, all people being condemned versus justification being righteous, and life versus death. There's a direct contrast between the two. I want you to keep this in mind because at the very last slide, this is going to come back and something hopefully may or may not surprise you of how this works all the way to Romans chapter 8. Okay? So life versus death, justification versus condemnation. So at the end of Romans chapter 5, it says the Torah came so that the transgression would increase. So when the Torah came, what happened? The transgression got bigger. So one of the effects of the Torah then, as we're going to see here later on in Romans chapter 7, is that the Torah actually causes us to sin more. That's one of the effects of the Torah coming into the world, or God giving us the Torah. And we'll talk about that later on. But when the sin increased, this transgression increased, grace abounded all the more. Right? Grace can overcome the sin that's brought forth through the Torah. Right? And Paul is just kind of giving us a little introduction. He's going to talk about more detail later. Paul has a tendency to do that in Romans, by the way. He kind of gives you a little taste of what's going to come. He's going to explain later on in the future. So he's not going to go into detail here, but we'll go into Romans chapter 7. So more of the relationship of law and sin in Romans 7. Okay? So what exactly does this mean? We'll see that. We'll figure it out. In Romans 5:20 it says, so going back here, the law came so that transgression would increase, but with sin increased, the grace abounded all the more. Why? So that as sin reigned in death, right? So we're bound to sin, which results in death. By the law, we saw that in verse 20. So how are we bound by sin? Through the Torah, right? You see how this is working. So it doesn't say explicitly in this verse, that's why it's parentheses, but we can apply based on the verse beforehand. So because we're bound in sin through the power of the law, brings forth death. Even so, grace might reign through righteousness to eternal life through Yeshua, Messiah, our Lord. So here we're bound by righteousness through the means of grace, which brings forth eternal life. Now, chapter 6. Romans 6, verse 1. What shall we say then? Shall we continue to sin that grace may increase? That's basically the question. Since we're bound to sin, can we sin and let grace increase? Well, the answer is no. If God is glorified by giving grace to sinners, why not sin more so that grace could increase in order for God to be glorified even more? That's what he's asking here. And so this, obviously, if you look at this pattern here that we've seen already, this kind of breaks the pattern. That's why it doesn't work. May it never be. This cannot happen. Why? Well, Paul says here very clearly, how shall we who died to sin still live in it? So here the idea is, this little cross mark here is the idea of crossing it out. We've died to sin. If we died to sin, how can we still live in sin? That doesn't make any sense. This bond here has been broken because we died to sin. Knowing this, that our old man has been crucified with him. So when Yeshua was him, is obviously we're referring to Yeshua, right? When Yeshua was crucified, what happened? We were crucified with him. So knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed. Here's the body of sin. For what reason? So that we will no longer serve sin. So this idea then is that because the body of sin has been destroyed, that bondage has disappeared, that slavery to sin is gone. For he who has died has been freed from sin. So here we have this idea of being bonded to sin, right? We're a slave, that's what the circle represents. Bonded to sin, but when we die, we are no longer slaves to sin. And that's his point. Paul's point is that because we've been crucified with the Messiah, our nature has changed. Something has happened to us that we are no longer bound to sin as we were before. But what are we bound to? If we're not bound to sin, what are we bound to? We're bound to righteousness. Now we're a slave to righteousness, as we'll see in the next verse here. That's what the circles represents. So now we're bound to righteousness, not to sin. Something has changed in us, in our hearts. So even so, consider yourself to be dead to sin, but alive to God in Messiah Yeshua. Alright? So here we have this idea that here we are in sin, but he says, consider yourself dead to sin. We're not bound to sin, but now we're alive in Yeshua the Messiah. For sin shall not be mastered over you, because you are not under law, but under grace. Now, those who have been in the Messianic movement long enough, had discussions with other people outside the Messianic movement, probably had this verse stuffed in your face lots and lots of times. I'm not under law, I'm not under Torah, I'm under grace. Okay. But let's be consistent about what we've learned so far in this passage. So here we see this, for sin shall not be master over you. When you talk about master, it's something we're bound to, right? So sin shall not be master itself over you, and because you are no longer under law. So how should we render this but under grace? What should it look like? Well, let's do this. We're not under law anymore. Why? Because that bond has been destroyed. But what are we under? We're under grace. And so under grace then means, if we're not under sin anymore, which you see in the previous slide, then we're under obedience. You see? So we are under grace, meaning that we can obey now. Before, we couldn't obey, because the Torah was making our sin increase, revealing our sin even more, making that bond strong. So if we're not under sin, what are we under? We're under obedience. The question is, obedience to what? That's the question. We're going to figure out later on. But for now, we're going to see that there's a difference between under law and under grace here. Now, just as a quick preview, what is Paul talking about here? He's not talking about dispensation of time. He's talking about what is our state of living this out practically in our own individual lives. That's the context. Remember, we're talking about sanctification in this section, right? That's what Paul's making reference to here. All right, what then? Shall we sin because we're not under law but under grace? So Paul is saying, if we're not under sin, shall we continue to sin? No, of course not. This doesn't make any sense. The result of this bond cannot refer to more sin because something has changed. We're under obedience now because we're under grace. He would say, may it never be. May this not be the conclusion from what we've seen. Why? Do you not know that when you present yourselves to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves to the one you obey, either for sin resulting in death. So when we're under sin, we're a slave to sin that results in what? Death. Or obedience resulting in righteousness. So now over here, I added obedience here, but somebody said, hey, Eric, you're just adding that in. That's not what it says. But in the very next verse, in verse 16, Paul adds that into obedience here, so now the pictures match. You see, I'm not making things up. I'm trying to be consistent on what Paul's trying to say here. So when you're bound to sin, that's going to bring death. Or when you're bound to obedience or slave to obedience, that's going to bring righteousness. Verse 17, but thanks be to God, though you were slaves to sin, right? We were slaves to sin. What happened? You became obedient from the heart. To that form of teaching which you were committed, having been freed from sin, you became slaves to righteousness. So here we go, we were slaves to sin. That's what the circle represents. We're bound by sin through slavery. We died, right? We got freed from that bond, and then now we're slaves to righteousness. Which means we're obedient from the heart. That's a result of being slaves to righteousness. We're obedient from the heart. Rather than just doing this idea of exterior works, it is working from the inside out, rather than just direct work salvation kind of idea. I am speaking in human terms because of the weakness of your flesh. For just as you presented your members as slaves to impurity and to lawlessness. So here we are. This is something in the past. Notice he's using past tense. This is something that happened to you. You were slaves to impurity and lawlessness, resulting in further lawlessness. This is the conclusion of that bond. So now that you're believers, present your members as slaves to righteousness, resulting in what? Sanctification. Again, the chart here is trying to be consistent all the way through. So does everyone see he's talking about before faith and after faith? Does everyone see that? Okay. Verse 6:22. But now having been freed from sin and enslaved to God, you derive your benefit resulting in sanctification and the outcome eternal life. So here's a picture of you're a slave to sin, which resulted in further lawlessness, which we saw in the previous verse. Now we're free from sin. That bond has been destroyed, right? Now what happens to us? We are slaves to God, resulting in what? Sanctification, and the outcome is what? Eternal life. So let's look down here then. What do we have down here? For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Messiah Yeshua our Lord. So this further lawlessness then results in what? Death. Wow, isn't that interesting? Paul is contrasting life and death again, which we already saw in chapter 5. Right? He's being consistent on what he's trying to further explain here. So when you're bound to God, or Yeshua brings forth life, when you're bound to Adam or sin, as you saw in chapter 5, it brings forth death. Now we get into the meat of things in Romans chapter 7. Or do you not know, brethren, from speaking to those who know law, that the law has dominion over a person as long as he lives? Or do you not know? Here Paul wishes to further expound his point in chapter 6 of dying and to be free from sin rather than starting a new topic. Now that's very important because we need to understand when we read Scripture, when is there a break in subject? Is Paul going into a new subject or is he continuing on what he was just talking about? And Paul has a tendency to expound on what he just was just explaining in the previous chapter by giving a further example. And that happens to be the case. So when he says, or do you not know? He's saying, look, if you don't believe me, don't you know this principle that I'm trying to teach you here? So Paul is giving an analogy, what we're going to see in chapter 7. Does everyone see that? Okay. Has dominion. The word dominion here in the Greek is an active verb. And this is important here. Because when you read it in English, has dominion, it doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like it's a verb at all, right? It's just something that you have, but it's an active verb. by active verb, it means it's something is done. This verb is doing something to the subject. So the word dominion here is in the Greek is an active verb, which means that the subject, in this case the law, is doing something to the object. In this case, the person. So the law is actively doing something to us. Well, the question is, what is the law doing? Right? And that's what we're going to see. This is something that's very important. So the law is doing an action upon us, not just simply not simply a possession, but it's actually doing an action. So note the following example in Romans 6:14, where the same Greek word in the same active tense is used, which is interesting because you don't see this in English. You see this in the Greek. So this word here, has dominion, is in the same verbal tense, active verb, is used in Romans 6:14. So let's go back to 6:14. What does it say? For sin shall not master itself over you, because you are not under law, but under grace. Master itself over you is the same word has dominion. So we can reread Romans 7:1 as this. Or do you not know, brethren, for the law has mastered itself over you as over the person as long as he lives. If they were to translate this correctly, they should have translated these exactly the same to be consistent, but unfortunately translators don't always do that. So this idea is that, again, the law is doing something to us. That is a key point here in Romans 7:1. What action is the law doing to the person that lives? What is this thing that it's doing? That's what we need to ask ourselves. So let's go to the example that Paul's going to say in verse 2. For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. Okay, so let's put this in chart form. A woman is bound to her husband by what? The Torah, or we could say the covenant, right? She makes a covenant with her husband, so now she's bound to him. They're bound to each other. All right, does that make sense? Okay. He's setting up the analogy here. But if the husband dies, she's been released from the Torah, or from the law, of her husband. The covenant here, the covenant of marriage. So if the husband's dead, what happens? She's released. She's no longer bound by it. Make sense? Okay. So then, now he's going further into analogy. So then, if where a husband lives and she marries another man, she will be called an adulteress. So here we have this idea: she's trying to be bound to another man while her husband lives, but she can't do that because she's bound by this covenant that she's made with her husband. All right, so Paul's saying, he's giving an example of, well, her husband dies, she's released, but if her husband doesn't die, she's considered an adulteress. Again, this idea of death is doing something here. So this is considered this situation here that the woman finds her in is considered not lawful. It's considered adultery. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law. So that she is no longer an adulteress, though she is married to another man. Now, what's interesting about this is that, and I want to show this here, is interesting to you, is that when her husband dies, she's free from that covenant, but when she marries another man, doesn't she goes back into another covenant with the man? So she still has a law here that she has to follow that makes her bound to the man. She gets, well, I'm married now, so I'm married to a new man that I don't have to follow, and I'm not under law anymore, so I can do whatever I want. No, she's still under a covenant that she's been married to. That's what this implies, which is married to another man. So this is lawful. This makes sense. Let's look at verse 4. Here then. Therefore, my brethren, you have become dead to the law through the body of Messiah. Okay, here we got a problem here. If we're dead to the law, we don't have to keep it. Right? Is that what Paul's trying to say? That now that we're in the Messiah, all the kosher laws, all the Sabbath, and everything's been done away because we're in the body of Messiah? Is that what he's trying to communicate to us? Well, let's look at the diagram here that we've been seeing. Therefore, my brethren, you have become dead to the law. Why are we becoming dead to the law? Through the body of Messiah. So through the body of Messiah, right? Well, have we seen this before? We saw this in chapter 6. We've been crucified with the Messiah. Remember that verse in chapter 6? So we've been crucified with Messiah. We become dead to the law through the body of Messiah. That's another way of saying that. So what happens? We're no longer bound to this husband. Who's this husband? Well, we haven't got to that yet. But we know we have this law here. This law is what holds us to this husband. That you may be married to another. Who are we getting married to? Oh, we've been married to Messiah, who was raised from the dead, is obviously referring to Messiah, that we should bear fruit to God. So what's the result? What is in this marriage here? What is the fruit of this marriage? What are the children of this marriage? That we bear fruit to God. But there's a problem here. These two are exactly the same, except one is green and one is orange. How do we understand this? Well, what is Paul trying to say here? For when we were in the flesh, notice that he used past tense. For when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were aroused by the law will work in our members to bear fruit to death. So what is a husband here? What's the husband that's underlined here? What? Sin. Or we can say Adam. We can say, for when we were in Adam, the sinful passions were aroused by the law. So the previous husband that we've been talking about here is Adam, which we learned about in Romans chapter 5. For when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were what? Aroused by the law. Right? This is what bounds us to Adam, because the law, what did the law do again? It causes our transgressions to increase. Because why? Because of our sinful nature that we were inherited from Adam. Work in our members to bear fruit to death. You see that? How are the sinful passions aroused by the law? That's the question we ask ourselves. How are the sinful passions aroused by the law? Verse 6. But now we have been released from the Torah. Here's the black and white, right, guys? We've been released from the Torah. We don't have to keep it anymore, right? Is that what he's talking about? No, he's not talking about keeping the Torah. Now we have been released from the Torah. We've been released from being in Adam by the flesh that bears fruit to death, having died to that, meaning the flesh, to that by which we were bound. So this represents death. We've died to this bond here that kept us in our flesh or in Adam through the power of the law that bore fruit to death, Romans 7:5, right? And how do we do that? Through the sacrifice of Yeshua, through dying with the Messiah, being crucified with him. So that, why? For the very reason that to serve in the newness of the Spirit of the law. Now, I added the word of the law here because we're going to see this explained here in Romans 8:2. But the newness of the Spirit of the law. And I'll go into a further explanation when we get there. Romans 8:2. So to show you I'm not just adding it in there. But in the Messiah, so let's go back and let's look at that again. So in the Messiah, when we were crucified, we were freed from that bondage, so we can be bound to Messiah, not in our flesh or in Adam, through the newness of the Spirit. And what's the result of that? Bear fruit to God. So here we bear fruits to death, and here we bear fruit to God. In this previous verse we just saw. Make sense? And not in the oldness of the letter of the law. Oldness of the letter of the law. So here we have the newness of the Spirit of the law, and we have the oldness of the letter of the law. Notice, they both have the law in them, but one brings us death and one brings us life. Why? Because it depends if you're in Adam or you're in Messiah. So when Paul says here, you've been released from the law, what does that mean? Well, we're going to get to that in a minute. What does that mean to be released from the law? What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Look at this here. Does the law equal sin? What's he going to say? If the law arouses sinful passions in our members, verse 7:5, and was given so that the sin would increase, Romans 5:20, does that mean that the law and sin are virtually identical? Here. May it never be. This does not equal each other. Why? On the contrary, I would not have come to know or experience sin except through the law. So when we're in sin, what does it come to? When the law comes, we know and experience sin. That's what bounds us. That's what bounds us to the death that we will. Those who are in the sin will experience. For I would not have known anything about coveting if the law had said, "You shall not covet." Okay, so Paul. And by the way, what commandment is he quoting here? The Ten Commandments, right? He's quoting from the very last commandment of the Ten Commandments. Coveting. Know and experience coveting. Alright, but sin, flesh, taking the opportunity through the commandment, produced coveting in me of every kind. So here, when we're bound to sin, produced what? Through the commandment, or through the law, produced coveting me or death. So through the commandment, producing death in me of every kind. From apart from the law, sin is dead, or we can say inactive. So from apart from the law, what happens? There is no sin, there is no death. So here we have the idea of, so when there's no law, there is no sin. And Paul said that actually in Romans 5:13. 1 Corinthians 15:6. The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. So here he's emphasizing sin and death with the law now. Remember? So he's not talking practical ways of keeping the Torah like kosher laws. That's not what he's making reference to here, which we're going to see here in a minute. Verses 7-12. So then, the law is holy, and the commandment singular is holy, righteous, and good. Therefore, did that which was good become a cause of death for me? Now, when we look here, this doesn't fit the pattern, right? Because we're not bound by the law in this way. The law should be here. But notice just real quickly that Paul says the commandment is holy and righteous and good. That the Torah is good. He's not disparaging the law here. But what is Paul disparaging? May it never be. This is not true. Paul's disparaging what? Rather, it's not the law that's the problem, it's our sin that's the problem. Who we're married to is the problem, which is Adam, right? Rather, it was sin, or the flesh, or Adam, in order that it might be shown to be sin, but through effecting my death. That through that which is good, so that through the commandment sin would become utterly sinful. So through the good commandment, sin will be shown as evil as it is. That's basically why God gave it to us. So it's doing something to us. Again, what is this? What is the Torah doing to us that's causing our death? It's doing something to us, and we haven't answered that question yet. And we will in a minute. So it's shown utterly sinful. Right? For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of flesh, sold into bondage of sin. Now, we're going to talk about this in more detail when we get to here in a couple of weeks. But this is where a lot of people get tripped up, because Paul is using the present tense. I am of flesh, sold in bondage of sin. So he's saying Paul, as a believer, is sold under bondage of sin. Where previously in chapter 6 he says we're no longer under sin. Right? Sin shall not master itself over us. So what is he talking about here? After vindicating the law from being equated with sin, verse 7:7, and being a cause of death for him, verse 7:13, Paul turns his focus on what really is at fault for his sin and death. His flesh. It's the flesh, not the Torah. Unlike the Torah, it is his flesh that is sold into bondage of sin, and the cause of his sin is not good. Right? It's his flesh. And is at war with the law of his mind, and he wants to do good. So in chapter 7, he has his long diatribe of that which I do not want to do, that which I do not do, I want to do. right? He talks about that back and forth, the struggle that he's having. And basically, in summary, I'm not going to go through all that right now, but basically what he's explaining to you here, that his flesh wars against his spirit, and his spirit wars against the flesh. And this is what he says in Galatians. He says here, Galatians 5:17, for the flesh sets its desires against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, and these are in opposition to one another, so that you do not do the things that you please. Isn't that a perfect summary of Romans chapter 7 here? He said all that one verse in Galatians chapter 17, but he spends how many verses in Romans chapter 7 trying to explain what he said here. And so what Paul is explaining here in Romans chapter 7 is not the before and after faith. He's explaining the struggle that the believer has while in faith. So you do not do the things that you please. In other words, when he sins as a believer, that grieves his spirit within him, and he's displeased with that. He doesn't want to sin. But something inside of him, his flesh, is causing him to sin. And so that's what he means by here. So by the way, just as a quick review, looking at verse 17 and what we understand about chapter 7, does the unbeliever have the same struggle? No. Why not? Because he doesn't have the Spirit of God, correct. So this will not apply to the unbeliever. That's why this is referring to the state of the believing one, not the state of before faith. That would only make sense. All right, so at the end of chapter 7, it says, what a wretched man that I am. Who will set me free from the body of this death? Notice he's making reference to his physical body, the body of this death. He wants to be free from his physical body. Why? Because it's causing him to sin. It's causing him to have to struggle with sin. Now, what's his conclusion? Paul concludes this section with a cry of displeasure over his mortal flesh that he wishes to be free from. Even though believers are free from sin and are in the headship of Yeshua, they are still connected to Adam by the flesh until the time when mortality puts on immortality through the victory that is found in the Messiah. In other words, the resurrection. Thanks be to God through Yeshua Messiah our Lord. So now that we're in Messiah, so Messiah, we're waiting for that future redemption, the redemption of our bodies. So what is Paul's conclusion? So then, on the one hand, I myself, with my mind, am serving the law of God, but with the other, my flesh, serving the law of sin. This is a verse I like to always bring up to people that said that the Torah has been done away with. Because why would Paul then praise Yeshua, that we have redemption in Yeshua, and then at the very next breath say, so then I myself, meaning presently, in a state of grace, with my mind serving the law of what? The law of God. Why would he say the law of God if the law of God has been done away with? So he's saying he is serving the law of God in his present state of grace in the Messiah. But there's another law in his members. But on the other hand, with my flesh, serving the law of sin. Well, what is this law of sin he's making reference to? Well, people say it's the principle of sin. Okay, it's a principle. It's not necessarily the Torah, okay? But there's a law in him that he's fighting against. That's in his members. That's in his flesh. The law of God. Right? We already mentioned that. So let's do a review of what we've learned so far before we get into Romans chapter 8. So in Romans chapter 7, now we're going to go backwards here. In Romans chapter 7, verses 7 to 13, we're bound to sin through the good commandment which produces coveting. At Romans 7, 1 through 6, we saw that we're in the flesh, or in Adam, the oldest of the letter of the law, we bear fruit to death. At Romans 6, verses 14 through 19, when we're slaves to sin, we're under the law which produces further lawlessness. And Romans 5, the law was given so the transgression would increase. Sin reigned in death by the law. So basically all I did is I take those charts that we've previously seen, I just cut and paste it here. You can see the consistency all the way through from 7, 6, and 5. That's the consistency we want to follow through when we interpret Scripture, what Paul is trying to explain here. So here it's all green across the board. So this is always referring to before faith. Now let's look at the same understanding, but let's look at it after faith here. Going backwards again. So Romans 7, 1 through 6, that we're bound to Messiah, through the newness of the Spirit of the law, we bear fruit to God. Right? Bear fruit to God means to be obedient to God. Through the newness of the Spirit of the law, by being bound to Messiah. In Romans chapter 6, 14 through 19, we're slaves to righteousness. We're considered under grace, which produces sanctification, which is holiness, which is another way of saying bear fruit to God. In Romans chapter 5, but where the sin increased, the grace abounded all the more. This grace then is what? Causes us to overcome our sin and to bear fruit to God. So that grace might reign through righteousness to eternal life through Yeshua Messiah our Lord. That's the quote from Romans 5:21. Under law and under grace. What is this referring to? What does this mean? Romans 6:14. For sin shall not master itself over you, because you are not under law, but under grace. If grace is receiving something one does not deserve, then the opposite of grace is receiving something one does deserve. Does that make sense? What do those who are slaves to sin deserve? Death. What action is the law doing to the person that lives? Because remember we talked about, we didn't answer that question. Remember I said before that the law is doing something to us. In Romans 7:1, remember? Under the law means condemnation, penalty, and judgment. So when Paul says here, for the law shall not master itself over you, because you are not under the condemnation of the law, but you are under grace. So when Paul says you're not under the law, what he's making reference to is not making reference to some dispensation in time, or some dispensation in covenant, or whatever the case may be. He's talking about being condemned by the law. The law condemns us. Let's look at another verse here. When attempts to keep the Torah apart from faith and grace, sin becomes their master to produce sin and death through the knowledge and condemnation of the law. That's what the law does to us. When we, without being in the Messiah and apart from faith by the Spirit of God, all the law does is produce death and condemnation. That's what it actually does to us. That's the very action that it does. Let's look at another verse. What shall we say then? Shall we sin because we are not under the... Right? We're not under the judgment of the law, but under grace? May it never be. So this makes more sense. If somebody says, well, I'm not under the judgment of the law. The law can't condemn me anymore. So I can sin as much as I want. That makes more sense with this verse. And Paul's saying, may it never be. Why? Because our nature has changed. Look at Romans 7:1. Or do you not know, brethren, for I speak to those who know the law, that the penalty of the law has dominion over a person as long as he lives. That's what he's saying here, the penalty. If the wages of sin is death, and you sin, the law is hovering over you, waiting to condemn you, giving that penalty. Well, as long as you live, the law is hovering over you. Well, as soon as you die, the law can't punish you anymore, right? The condemnation is done. Payment has been paid. Romans 7:4. Therefore, my brethren, you have become dead to the law. What do you mean dead to the what? Dead to the condemnation of the law through the body of the Messiah, that you may be married to another, to him who was raised from the dead, so that you may bear fruit to God. So we become dead to the deadness of the law that said we need to die through the body of the Messiah. Because Yeshua died in our place, took our penalty. The law can't condemn us anymore because the wages of sin is death. And so therefore we've been married to another man through the Messiah. So when Paul says you've been dead to the law, he's not talking about kosher laws here. He's not talking about Sabbath here. He's talking about the condemnation of the law brings for sinning. And that's happened through the body of the Messiah. Romans 7:6. But now that we have been released from the what? Released from the law. What does he mean by that? We have been released from the judgment of the law. The law can't judge us anymore. Having died to the flesh, that which we were bound, we served in the newness of the spirit of the law and not the oldness of the letter. So the law can't judge us anymore. It can't condemn us. It can't give us the penalty. It can't kill us anymore. Why? Because we've already died to the flesh. What we have here, newness of the spirit versus oldness of the letter. Spirit versus letter. Spirit versus letter. Where have you heard that before?
Corinthians.
Yes, Corinthians, right. Let's look at this. For while we were still helpless, at the right time, Messiah died for the ungodly. Going back to our first slide, remember? God demonstrated his own love towards us, and that while we were yet sinners, Messiah died for us. For while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son. Much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. Death is the means of how God reconciles sinners to himself. So let's ask the initial question we have. How does death reconcile us to God? How does it do it? How does that reconcile us to God? Galatians 2, 19 through 20. Paul answered this question clearly in Galatians chapter 2, which is parallel to Romans 7, 1 through 6. Which he says this, for through the law I died to the law. Wait a minute. For through the law I died to the law. What does it mean he died to law? What does that mean? He died to what? For through the law I died to the condemnation. For through the condemnation of law I died to law so that I might live to God. Right?
Why didn't they just write it like that?
So this is what he's saying here. For through the condemnation of the law, through the death that the law brings, I died to the death that the law brings, so that I might live to God. That's exactly what he's saying here, right? I have been crucified with the Messiah, so it is no longer I who live, but the Messiah lives in me. Remember, we've been married to another. And the life which I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Let's put this in a form here. The same form we've been seeing. So here we're in the flesh. Through the law, this brings judgment. Right? So through the law, I died to through the law. So through the condemnation, I died to condemnation. For what purpose? Right? So that it would no longer bring judgment. So that I might be bound to him through what? Through faith and grace. You see how this makes perfect sense? What he's been saying here all along in Romans 7? So that he might live to God. Right here. Might live to God. Romans 8:1. Therefore, now Paul's concluding what he's been saying since chapter 5. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Messiah Yeshua. If you want a verse that says what under the law means, here it is. The condemnation of law. We can say, therefore, there is now no condemnation under the law for those who are in Messiah Yeshua. But why? Because we've been bound to him. He's going to explain to it. There is no condemnation for those in Messiah because he, through his sacrificial death, has taken upon himself all of the condemnation of the law on behalf of those whom he has died. This substitute was the only means by which to rescue those helplessly enslaved to sin in Adam's headship to be placed in his headship. It is by his sacrificial death that guarantees and secures life and righteousness for everyone whom he has died. So this goes back to our conversation last week when he says, his death is a guarantee, and he secures life and righteousness for everyone whom he died for. So this is why there is no condemnation for those who are in Messiah Yeshua. If you're under the headship of Yeshua, you're not under Adam, because Adam brings death, Yeshua brings life and righteousness, right? Verse 8:2. For, Paul is giving an explanation of what he said in verse 1. For the law of the Spirit of life in Messiah Yeshua has set you free from the law of sin and death. Notice the word law there. Law of Spirit of life versus the law of sin and death. Now, some people say, well, this is just a principle of law. But I think it's more than that. I think it's more than just simply a principle. I think it's actually referring to the actual law itself. So let's look at here. So here, we're bound by sin in Adam. And we're bound by the law of sin and death, or the oldest of the letter, we saw in chapter 7, which brings about death. But you've been set free. The Spirit of grace has come down, has broken those bonds, and has transferred you from darkness to light in the Messiah, Yeshua, which now brings death. Which now brings life. You like that? See? Comes down, it frees us from that, and now we're in the Messiah, Yeshua. For what the law could not do, so when we're bound by the law, there's something the law can't do. What is it the law can't do? For what the law could not do, it cannot bring what? It can't bring life, righteousness, it can't conquer sin. The law does not give us power to do these things. It can't. It doesn't give us any power. For what the law could not do, why? Weak as it was through the flesh. Again, the pattern is still going through. So we see here that I have a little animation here. The law getting smaller because it has no power. It's losing power, right? It can't do anything for us. It can't bring about life and righteousness. God did. So God did something. He did what he did. He sent his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh, meaning what? As the likeness of Adam. He sent him as a man, right? Here's the son here, and he's clothed in flesh. He sent him in the likeness of sinful flesh. And what did he do? Did he go and condemn the law? He got rid of the law and says, oh, we don't have to keep the law anymore. Is that what he did? No. What does he condemn? As an offering for sin, right? He sacrificed him to do what? To condemn the law? He condemns sin in the flesh. He condemns the flesh, not the law, but he condemns our sinful nature. He condemns us who we are. To do what? So that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but walk according to the Spirit. Now look at that. Look at that. So now we're in the Son, we walk according to the Spirit of grace. The righteous requirement of the law is fulfilled in us. You see? Here would be the perfect opportunity. If Paul was saying that the law has been abolished because we're in the Messiah, this would have been a perfect time to say, God sent his Son in likeness of sinful flesh to abolish the law, so we don't have to keep it anymore. But that's not what he said. He abolished the sinful flesh. The sinful flesh is the problem, not the law. This is not what he was trying to say in Romans chapter 7. If the law was good, the commandment was holy, righteous, and good. The problem of the sin is not the law, it's our flesh. You see? So we have this, so we walk according to the Spirit, not according to the flesh. So this idea then, the law of the Spirit of life set us free from the law of sin and death. It's the same law. One is bound by Adam, which brings forth death, and that same law, when you're bound by in the Son, that's grace through the power of the Spirit, which we're able to keep the law now through the power of the Spirit. Romans 8, 5 through 6. For those who walk according to the flesh, set their minds on the things of the flesh. So we have here, those who walk according to the flesh are bound by the flesh, right? Set their minds on the things of the flesh. But those who are according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. So those who are the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. This is self-explanatory, but again, we're trying to be consistent with what we've been learning since we entered chapter 5. If you are in the flesh, your nature and your purpose and your desire is to do the things of the flesh, you will never, in the flesh, in Adam, in your sin, ever want to do the things of the Spirit. Why? Because you don't have the Spirit of God. Does that make sense? For the mindset of the flesh is death. If you're in the flesh, you'll do the things of the flesh, and that will result in death. But the mindset of the Spirit is life and peace. Because that's the things of the Spirit, life and peace. Again, the contrast, which we've seen way back at the beginning of chapter 5, of the two headships. Because the mindset of the flesh is hostile towards God, it does not submit to the law of God, nor has he been able to do so. So here's the key point. And when we get to chapter 8, I guarantee I'm going to be hammering this into your brains. The mind and the flesh is hostile towards God. Remember what the Paul say in Romans chapter 5. We were at enmity with God. We were enemies of God, but now through faith in the Messiah Yeshua, we're at peace. But now here we're hostile towards God. And so if you're in the flesh, you're hostile towards God. And what is the key point? For it does not submit to the law of God. Does not and cannot submit to the law of God, nor is even able to do so. See the word able there? That's a very important word. We're able to do so. When I say somebody is unable to do so, I'm saying that they do not have the capacity to do it. Would you agree that that's what that word means? So if you're in the flesh, deprived of the Spirit of God, can you please God in any way, shape, or form, according to this verse? No. You are incapable in and of yourself, apart from the Spirit of God, to please God. That's what this verse is saying. And yet, when you challenge people on this very verse, they'll say, no, I can still choose God apart from the Spirit of God. I have free will. I can choose God anytime I want. That's not what this verse says. And those in the flesh cannot please God. Those in the flesh are not able or cannot or incapable or in no way, shape, or form able to please God. Because they don't have the Spirit of God. They're bound by their flesh. They're bound by the sin of Adam. That's why. Romans 8:9. However, you are not in the flesh or not in Adam, but in the Spirit of God. If indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. And so what does that mean? So I have here, bringing up the old charts here. You are not in the flesh. Why? Because you've been cut off from the oldest of the letter of the law, from your flesh. And so now you're in the Messiah. You're in the Spirit of God. Right? The newness of the Spirit of the law, or grace, brings about life and peace. But if anyone does not have the Spirit of the Messiah, he does not belong to him. And of course, this is another beautiful verse I like to bring up. And that says, well, those who try to say that people before Yeshua were saved differently, or that people before Yeshua didn't have the Spirit of God and dwelling in him like they did to us, I simply say this. If you don't have the Spirit of God dwelling in him, according to Paul, then you don't belong to God. But did David belong to God? Did Moses belong to God? Did Abraham belong to God? If the answer is yes, then they must, by definition, have the Spirit of God in them. And notice the word here, the Spirit of Messiah. So, salvation has always been the same from the very beginning. You need to be saved through the Messiah by the power of the Spirit. And of course, this is supposed to show here that if we don't have the Spirit of God, what are we really in? We are really in the flesh. There is no neutral ground, folks. You're either in the flesh or you're in the Messiah. There is no neutral ground. Right? You either have your mindset in the flesh or your mindset in the Spirit. There is no neutral ground. Going back to Romans chapter 5. All right. So let's summarize what we've learned. And this is something that I really want to pay attention to. Because this is kind of bring up a different subject here. All right? So let's summarize everything we've learned from chapter 5 through 8. In Romans chapter 5, what do we see? When you're in Adam, we're in sin, which brings forth death. Remember that? Mm-hmm. But when you're in Yeshua, righteousness, which brings forth life. Pretty simple. That's pretty self-explanatory. We learned that in Romans chapter 5, the two headships. In Romans chapter 6, we saw that when you're slaves to sin, we're in the old man, and we're under the condemnation of the law, which brings about further lawlessness. You're slaves to sin, you're in the old man, under the condemnation of further lawlessness. You're under the law there. But when you're slaves to righteousness, you become a new man, right? You're under grace, and that brings forth sanctification or holiness. Now, I have new man here in italics because Paul doesn't specifically say the word new man. He says old man, But if we could be consistent going back and forth, I think we can imply the new man is here. Even though he doesn't specifically say it. But he does say old man. Romans chapter 7, what do we see? With oldness of the letter of the law, we bear fruit to death. Okay? And then when I say letter of the law, I think that's implied based on Romans chapter 8. Letter of what? Letter of the law. I think that makes sense. But on the other side, what do we see? The newness of the spirit of the law, based on Romans chapter 8:2. Romans of the spirit of the law, we bear fruit to God. Notice again, this is the same law. The same law is here, but what has changed? The law hasn't changed. It's either you're the old man or the new man. That's the difference. That's a different perspective of the Torah. Romans chapter 8, what do we see? Flesh, right? Mindset of the flesh. Law of sin and death. Cannot be subject to the law of God. Cannot please God. That's the result of being in the flesh. The mindset of the flesh of the law of sin and death, which brings about condemnation and sin. It brings about sin and condemnation because we can't please God. Obviously, the opposite of that in Romans chapter 8, what do we see? We have the Spirit, mindset of the Spirit, law of the Spirit of life, fulfills the law, the fulfillment of the law, and what's implied here is we're able to please God. That only makes sense. It doesn't say specifically, but that, given everything that we see here, this only makes sense. They're not able to please God. We cannot please God, but now we're able to please God through the power of the Spirit of the law. Now, there's something there there's something interesting here I want to show you. If Paul's point that believers are under a new law or a new standard of righteousness to live by, right? Is that Paul's point? Or is Paul's point that God has caused slaves to sin to correctly fulfill his law? I think the answer is obvious. Paul is not trying to communicate we are under a new law, a new standard of righteousness. He's trying to say that now that we've been, we were slaves to sin, and now we're not, and now we're able to fulfill what the law has told us to fulfill. We're able to keep it out the way God wanted us to fill out. We're able to do it. Right? We have the law on both sides. So on one hand, on this side, we have the curses of the law. The law curses us. That's another way of saying condemnation. We're not under the curse of the law anymore. And what is the other side? What do you think the other side is going to talk about?
Blessings of the law.
The blessings of the law, right? Well, where do we see the blessings of the law and the cursings of the law in the Bible?
Deuteronomy.
In Deuteronomy. That's in the Torah itself. So when you keep the law, you get the blessings of the law. When you disobey the law, you get the curses of the law. That's in the very Mosaic covenant itself. So he can't get rid of the Mosaic covenant if, in fact, blessings and cursings are found in the Torah itself. Right? Let's look at 2 Corinthians 5:17. Remember 2 Corinthians 5:17? It says here, if any man is a Messiah, behold, old has passed away, behold, all things have become new. Remember that verse? So here, 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, old. Right? And we have new or renew. However you want to look at it. New or renew. Old versus new. And where do we see this at? Oh, we have the old man, we have new man. Oldness of the letter of the law, the newness of the Spirit of God. Or the Spirit of the law, right? Old and new, old and new. Look at that. Now, let's add something else in here to understand what's really going on. Old covenant versus new covenant. You see that? What is the old covenant? According to this chart, what do you think the old covenant is? Old covenant is living a life of condemnation, breaking the Torah without the Spirit of God. That's what the old covenant is. And so if that's what the old covenant is, what is the new covenant? The new covenant is keeping the Torah by the power of the Spirit of God, the Spirit of God dwelling in you, and able to please God and fulfill the law.
Under grace.
Under grace. So if we're going to take this definition, which I believe is correct, what was Moses, Abraham, David, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, those men of God who lived by faith, were they under the old covenant or the new covenant?
New covenant.
They were the new covenant. But I thought the new covenant didn't start until after Yeshua died. No.
Why new covenant? No, the old covenant?
No, they're under the new covenant because they were slaves to righteousness. They were able to please God. They had faith in God.
Okay.
So that's the point. If we understand truly what the new and old covenant is, then it's not some kind of time-bound thing. It's not a testament in the Bible where we have two halves of our Bible, Old versus New Testament. That's not what the Old and New Covenant is. New Covenant is whether one is bound by the covenant, the same covenant, but they're living a life of sin, which will bring the curses of the covenant, or they're living a life of faith and righteousness towards God by the power of the Spirit, which brings about the blessings of the covenant, but that is a new covenant. So this whole time, from Romans chapter 5 to Romans chapter 8, what has Paul been talking about here? Old covenant versus new covenant. That's what he's been talking about. He's not talking about some set of laws, kosher laws, Sabbath, sacrificial system, whatever the case may be, whatever you will put under that, keeping the Moedim. What he's talking about is living the life of God. Now that we have the Spirit of life, how should that look like? We need to keep the Torah through the power of the Spirit of God. Through able to fulfill the Torah and able to please God because we have the Spirit of God in us. Based on the sacrificial life of taking us out of Adam into Yeshua. That is what Paul's been talking. He spent 3.5 chapters talking about that very one subject. And yet we have a whole entire Christian system that all they can talk about is how we're not to keep kosher anymore. We have missed the boat. It is that simple. But unfortunately, tradition has gotten in the way of this. And this is part of the reason why I made this, to make this make sense, because every time I show this to somebody, there's nothing to say. Because I'm trying to be consistent from the very beginning to the very end. What was interesting is that I once had a theologian. I went to a apologetics conference one time. And I don't remember how we were talking about something. And he says, one of the hardest concepts to understand, that it was either from Self or another theologian, and just in general, he says, one of the hardest concepts to ever understand in the Scriptures is the concept of what does it mean to be under the Torah? Or what does it mean to be under the law, he would have said. And I look back at that now, I was like, man, that's one of the most simplest things to understand. Because in his mind, he was struggling with, well, if we're no longer under the law, then why do I need to keep the law? And he's got it all wrong. It's because it's not about what laws we keep and don't keep. And that there's a whole theological systems, there's a whole books written on this fact, well, we get to keep these. We're going to break down the law into moral, ceremonial, and moral, civil, and civil. And then we only keep the moral laws, we don't keep the civil laws, we don't keep the ceremonial laws. And they have all these lists, and they're trying to figure out, okay, what's okay to keep this one because it's been repeated in the New Testament, but this one wasn't repeated, so we don't have to keep this one. And this whole theological system trying to figure this out, and that's not even what Paul's talking about. That's not even what he's talking about. And why do they get this perspective? It's called tradition. Tradition. And basically, this is why I refuse to do my very best. I refuse to call the Old Testament Old Testament and the New Testament New Testament, because that's not what this is. That fuels his idea against this. Because if we start calling the Old Testament Tanakh and the New Testament the Apostolic Scriptures or something else, this whole idea of old versus new, time-bound stuff begins to very quickly disappear. So I really wanted to share this overview. I think it was very important before we get into the nitty-gritty of these verses, and we go verse by verse, and 5 through 8. Because I want to always have this in our back of our mind as we're reading it, to keep our eye on the ball of what we're reading, of what Paul is trying to communicate. Because I think things will go a lot better for us. So just to reiterate and just to review, Romans 6, 7, and 8 is talking about how one lives as a believer in the Messiah today. Or at all, at any point in time. They're going to struggle with sin. They're going to struggle with the law condemning, feel like the law is condemning them, but Paul wants to say there is no condemnation for those in Messiah Yeshua. Even though you have this struggle with sin, even though you're condemning yourself, Yeshua has done it all. and that there's a new life in you, consider yourself dead to sin in Messiah Yeshua. That's what he's making reference to here. He's not making reference to the different types of laws we need to keep and don't keep.
So we haven't been set free from the law of God. We've been set free from the law of sin and death.
Yes. We've been set free from condemnation of the law. He says, that's why he says, the law shall not master itself over you because you're no longer under sin but under grace. Or did I say that backwards? No, sin shall not master itself on you because you're no longer sin but under grace. Even that verse by itself is that what does sin and the Torah have to do with being under grace? How can sin master me? People just focus in on law versus grace rather than looking at what the verse is even trying to communicate in and of itself. And so and what's funny is, even people in the congregation of Sheresh, because they know my background, they know what I believe. When they ask me, so Eric, do you believe that you're under law, under grace? I go, I believe I'm not under law. I tell them that, and their eyes are like deer in the headlights. What? You don't believe you're under law, but you keep kosher and you wear tzitzit. Yeah, and so? But then how can you say you're not under law? Well, my first question is, well, how do you define under law? Well, I don't know. That means, you just got to keep it, right? No. they never even took one step to think about what does it mean to be under law. They just see under law equals need to keep the law, and that's not what it means. And what's interesting that Paul uses the phrase under law in the scriptures, and every time he uses the word under the law, every single time it's used, it's always making reference to condemnation of the law. Every single time, both in Galatians and in Romans. Now, there's a phrase in our English translations in Romans chapter 3, which I think we talked about before, when it says under the law, but that's actually a poor translation. It doesn't mean under the law there. Actually, in the Greek, it means in the law, which is different. And that's in Romans chapter 3, verse 20, I believe. That's not making reference to under law. It's meaning in the law, meaning being associated with the law, meaning the Jewish people. So, unfortunately, our translators didn't do a very good job translating that word there, which can throw people off. But yeah, that's all I have. I mean, I'm hoping to model for you how do we interpret Scripture. We interpret Scripture by following the context all the way through, not just looking at a verse, not just looking at a subject, but try to follow it through the argument, because this whole time Paul is arguing for something. And when we read the Scriptures, another thing I'll help get the model for you too is to ask questions. Paul says this. Why is he saying it? Let me see if I find the answer. That is a skill I think that people just don't do. And when I do the Bible study with my kids, I sit there and after we read the passage, we can read the first two verses of a passage, right? And I ask them questions of what they just read. They go, well, I don't know. We just read it. And they try to come up with the answer themselves. Like, no, don't come up with the answer. Read the passage that we just read, and the answer is right there. And they're starting to catch on. And I think the more questions we ask as we read the Scriptures, the better off we are in trying to understand what it is it's saying, and not coming up with our own interpretation, but getting our interpretation from the text itself. So I think that's a very important skill to have. So 1, ask questions, and 2, follow the argument all the way through. Let's find the connection, because especially with Paul, and Paul is famous for doing this. When people don't understand it with Paul tends to repeat himself over and over again on a major point. And here, he took 3.5 chapters to explain what is one concept. So he's repeating himself, not going off into different subjects. We saw this earlier in Romans chapter 2, and we'll see it other words as well in Romans chapter 9 and elsewhere as well.